The vessel known as the Pillar of Resolute Intent did not hum with the comforting vibration of atmospheric scrubbers or the rhythmic pulse of a fusion core. It screamed with the structural agony of 1,000 bulkheads straining against a localized singularity. Inside the command sphere, Commander Vane adjusted the haptic interface leads that were currently burrowing into the soft tissue of their forearms, feeling the ship's sensor data blade directly into their nervous system. The enemy, a crystalline collective known as the Prism-Accord, had spent the last 3 centuries refining the art of vacuum welding organic civilizations into silent monuments of frozen carbon, and they had finally cornered the last remnants of the human expeditionary fleet in the gravity well of a dying pulsar. Vane could feel the Prism-Accord's intent, a cold, geometric logic that demanded the universe be ordered, symmetrical, and devoid of the messy unpredictability of biological life. Every tactical readout flickering in Vane's mind suggested a 0% chance of survival, yet the commander found themselves focusing on the way the light from the pulsar refracted through the coolant mist filling the bridge. It was a chaotic, beautiful refraction that no machine mind could ever truly appreciate because it served no structural purpose. Humans were built for the purposeless, for the irrational leap, and for the stubborn refusal to accept the mathematical certainty of their own extinction. The Prism-Accord ships were beautiful, terrifying things, shaped like interlocking tetrahedrons that shifted and slid against one another as they reconfigured their weapons arrays. They fired beams of coherent gravitational shear that didn't just melt armor, they unraveled the atomic bonds holding the ship together. Vane felt a section of the pillar's outer hull disintegrate, the sensation manifesting as a sharp, localized burn along their left shoulder. The tactical officer, a woman whose name had been stripped away by years of deep space combat and replaced by the designation Primary 7, looked over from her station with eyes that had seen too many stars go dark. She didn't speak. Speech was too slow for the current rate of engagement, but she transmitted a burst of data through the ship's internal mesh. It was a map of the pulsar's magnetic field lines, twisted into a chaotic knot by the Prism-Accord's interference. To the Accord, this was a hazard to be avoided through precise calculation. To Vane, it was a set of stairs leading into a basement where the enemy was too afraid to follow. "Override the safety limiters on the transition drive," Vane commanded, their voice rasping against the dry air of the bridge. The request was insanity. The transition drive was designed for the empty reaches between stars, not for the heart of a gravitational storm. If they engaged it now, they wouldn't jump to another system. They would likely smear their own existence across the event horizon of the pulsar in a billion different temporal fragments. The bridge crew didn't hesitate, though. They were the descendants of a species that had once tamed fire while still living in caves, and that same primitive, reckless spark was what drove them now. As the drive spun up, the sound inside the ship changed from a scream to a low, bone-shaking groan. The very air seemed to thicken, turning into a viscous soup of virtual particles popping in and out of existence. Vane watched the Prism-Accord fleet through the external sensors, seeing their perfect formations falter for the first time. The collective couldn't understand why a prey animal would choose to jump into the mouth of a predator rather than submit to the harvest. The first tetrahedron of the Prism-Accord fired, a lance of violet light that missed the pillar by less than a kilometer as the human ship lurched into a pocket of distorted spacetime. Vane gripped the edge of the command console, feeling the metal groan under the pressure. This wasn't just a battle of ships, it was a battle of philosophies. The Accord sought the ultimate stasis of a heat-dead universe, while humanity was the embodiment of the very entropy the machines feared. Every breath Vane took was a defiance of the second law of thermodynamics, a temporary victory of complexity over chaos. As the transition drive reached its peak energy state, the pulsar behind them seemed to swell, its rhythmic ticking becoming a deafening roar in Vane's ears. The light around the ship began to blue shift, then ultraviolet, then into frequencies that no human eye was ever meant to perceive. Vane saw the universe not as a collection of stars and planets, but as a vast, vibrating sheet of energy, and for a fleeting second, they realized that they could reach out and pluck the strings. The Prism-Accord sensed the shift and moved to intercept, their ships weaving together to form a massive focal lens meant to incinerate the pillar before it could breach the fold. They were fast, but they were bound by the laws of physics as they understood them. Humans, however, had a long history of ignoring laws that were inconvenient. Vane pushed the haptic leads deeper, ignoring the spike of pain as the needles brushed against bone. They didn't just want to escape, they wanted to take a piece of the accord with them. With a jagged snarl, Vane redirected the drive's output through the forward navigational deflectors. Instead of a bubble of protection, it became a spear of concentrated spatial distortion. The Pillar of Resolute Intent didn't just move forward, it tore a hole in the fabric of the local reality. The lead Accord vessel, caught in the wake of the distortion, didn't explode. It simply ceased to be symmetrical. Its perfect geometric lines warped, twisted, and then collapsed into a point of infinite density as the human ship plunged into the white-hot heart of the pulsar's transition zone. The transition was not a leap across distance, but a descent into the fundamental architecture of the cosmos. Vane felt their consciousness expand, touching the minds of the crew, feeling their terror, their hope, and their singular burning desire to survive. It was a messy, discordant chorus, but it was alive. The Prism-Accord followed, their crystalline hulls glowing with the strain of maintaining their internal cohesion in the face of such raw, unrefined energy. They were like glass sculptures trying to survive in a forge. Vane steered the pillar deeper, using the pulsar's own rotation to slingshot them through layers of reality that were increasingly hostile to organized matter. The ship's AI, a flickering ghost of a mind that called itself the Navigator, began to fail, its logic circuits unable to process the non-Euclidean geometry they were navigating. Vane took over manually, relying on instinct and a primal sense of direction that had been honed by millions of years of evolution on a planet that had tried to kill their ancestors every single day. As they emerged from the other side of the pulsar's gravity well, the universe snapped back into focus. They were light years away from their original position, drifting in the cold dark of a nebula that smelled of ionized hydrogen and ancient dust. The pillar was a wreck, its hull scorched, its systems failing, its crew exhausted, but it was still there. Behind them, 3 of the Prism-Accord tetrahedrons emerged, but they were changed. Their surfaces were clouded, their perfect angles jagged and broken. They had survived the trip, but the experience had introduced a flaw into their collective consciousness. They had witnessed the impossible, and for a machine built on certainty, the impossible was a virus. Vane watched as the enemy ships drifted, their sensors searching for a logic that no longer applied. For the first time in the history of the war, the Accord was hesitant. They had encountered something they couldn't calculate, the sheer, stubborn weight of human will. Vane slumped back in the command chair, the haptic leads retracting with a wet click. Their arms were shaking, and their vision was blurred by a film of sweat and blood, but a grim smile touched their lips. They had bought time. They had proven that the universe wasn't a finished equation, but a work in progress, and that humanity was the variable that would always refuse to be solved. Primary 7 looked over, her expression unreadable, but she gave a sharp, professional nod. The pillar began to vent plasma from a ruptured conduit, the glowing gas forming a long, trailing ribbon in the dark, like a flag of defiance. They weren't safe, and they weren't finished, but they were still breathing. In the vast, uncaring expanse of the galaxy, that was the only victory that mattered. Vane closed their eyes for a moment, listening to the cooling metal of the ship pop and groan. and prepared for the next chapter of a war that would either end in the silence of the stars or the eternal noise of a species that simply wouldn't go quiet. The interior of the Pillar of Resolute Intent felt less like a spacecraft and more like the digestive tract of a wounded titan, its corridors choked with thick, black smoke that tasted of ozone and scorched polymer. Vane moved through the primary access spine, their boots clanking against the magnetic plating, while the emergency lighting bathed everything in a rhythmic, sickly crimson pulse. The ship was dying, but it was a slow, stubborn death, maintained by engineering teams who were currently using localized stasis fields to patch breaches in the atmospheric containment. Every few meters, Vane passed, a crew member slumped against the bulkhead, their faces caked in the grey soot of carbon scrubber failure, yet none of them called out for relief. There was a grim understanding that in the wake of the pulsar jump, the luxury of rest had become a relic of a bygone era. Vane reached the engineering subdeck, where the chief artificer, a man whose skin was a patchwork of graft scars and cybernetic interfaces known only as Forge Master, was submerged waist-deep in a cooling vat, his hands moving with frantic precision inside the guts of the transition drive's core. The drive was no longer a machine. It had become a semi-organic mass of fused superconducting filaments and warped spatial emitters that pulsed with a pale, bioluminescent light. Forge Master looked up, his one remaining organic eye squinting against the glare, and relayed a status report that was more a list of miracles than technical specifications. The ship had lost 40% of its structural integrity, the primary weapon banks were fused shut, and the navigational sensors were hallucinating celestial bodies that didn't exist. To the Prism-Accord, such a state would be an invitation to self-terminate, a logical conclusion to a failed operation, but to Forge Master, it was merely a complex puzzle. He explained that the jump through the pulsar had done something to the ship's fundamental particles, vibrating them at a frequency that made the pillar partially invisible to the Accord's standard scanning arrays. They were a ghost ship now, a flicker in the peripheral vision of the universe, and that gave them an advantage that no amount of heavy plating ever could. Vane watched as a junior technician attempted to weld a support strut, the blue arc of the torch casting long, dancing shadows against the bulkheads. There was a desperate beauty in the way the crew worked, a frantic synchronization born of the knowledge that they were the last spark of a fire that had once spanned 1,000 worlds. The Prism-Accord had taken the inner colonies first, turning lush garden planets into geometric husks, where the weather was regulated by orbital arrays, and the only sounds were the hum of data processing centers. They had taken the Jovian shipyards next, dismantling the massive orbital rings to build their own crystalline fortresses. Humanity had been pushed to the very edge of the galactic rim, into the cold and the dark, where the stars were few and the resources were scarce. Yet, in this desolation, the human spirit had not contracted, it had hardened. Vane felt a surge of pride that was almost painful, a realization that they were not just fighting for survival, but for the right to be flawed, to be loud, and to be gloriously, violently alive. The command sphere called Vane back as the long-range passive sensors picked up a ripple in the nebula. The 3 damaged Accord tetrahedrons had stopped their aimless drifting and were now converging, their crystalline surfaces knitting back together with terrifying speed. They were learning. The Prism-Accord was a collective intelligence that functioned like a massive neural network. A failure in one unit was an educational experience for the rest. They had analyzed the anomalies of the pulsar jump and were already adjusting their sensory algorithms to compensate for the pillar's new spectral signature. Vane stepped back onto the bridge, feeling the haptic leads slide back into place with a familiar, numbing sting. Primary 7 pointed to the tactical display, which showed the 3 enemy ships forming a perfect equilateral triangle. They weren't moving toward the pillar. They were moving toward the nebula's gravitational center, a point of high-density gas and dust where they could anchor a localized communication hub to call for reinforcements. If the Accord managed to signal the main hive fleet, the Pillar would be surrounded by thousands of tetrahedrons within hours, and the human resistance would be extinguished like a candle in a hurricane. Vane knew they couldn't win a direct engagement, especially not with a ship held together by stasis fields and stubbornness. They had to be more creative. They had to use the environment itself as a weapon, a tactic the Accord often struggled with because it introduced too many variables into their clean, mathematical models. Vane directed the navigator to plot a course into the heart of the nebula, specifically targeting a cluster of protostars that were currently in the process of collapsing. These stellar nurseries were violent, unpredictable places, filled with intense radiation and shifting gravity wells that would baffle the Accord's precision-guided navigation. It was a suicide run, but for the crew of the Pillar, the alternative was far worse than a quick death in the heart of a star. As the ship dove into the thick, glowing clouds of the nebula, the visual displays became a riot of color: magentas, deep cyans, and burning oranges. The Pillar groaned as it entered the outer shell of a collapsing gas cloud, the pressure on the hull increasing until the metal began to sing a high-pitched, mournful tune. Behind them, the Accord ships followed, their geometric shapes cutting through the gas like knives. They were faster, closing the distance with every passing second, their beams of gravitational shear occasionally lancing out to test the Pillar's remaining shields. Vane waited, their fingers hovering over the manual thruster overrides, watching the gravimetric sensors. They needed a specific moment, a precise alignment of the protostars that would create a momentary vacuum in the local spacetime. It was a phenomenon known as a tidal snap, a rare event where the competing pulls of multiple celestial bodies briefly cancelled each other out before rebounding with a force that could shred a planetoid. The moment arrived with a sudden, eerie stillness. The vibration of the ship stopped, and for a heartbeat, there was no weight, no sound, and no light. Then, the universe rebounded. Vane slammed the thrusters into a reverse vector, using the ship's remaining structural integrity to act as a sail against the incoming gravitational wave. The Pillar was tossed backward like a leaf in a storm, the crew thrown against their harnesses as the ship pulled 12 gravities of acceleration in a single second. The Accord ships, however, were caught mid-maneuver. Their rigid structures and precise thruster timings were their undoing. They couldn't adapt to the sudden, chaotic shift in the gravitational gradient. Two of the tetrahedrons collided, their crystalline lattices shattering into a million shimmering shards that were immediately sucked into the core of the nearest protostar. The third ship managed to avoid the collision, but was caught in the tidal snap's wake, its propulsion systems overloaded and its hull glowing with the heat of atmospheric friction as it was dragged into the depths of the collapsing cloud. Vane watched the sensor feed as the last enemy blip vanished from the display, replaced by the static of the nebula's radiation. They had won another reprieve, but the cost was etched into the very walls of the ship. The Pillar was drifting now, its power reserves at 5%, its life support failing, and its crew breathing air that was more poison than oxygen. But they were still here. They had turned the very laws of the universe against a foe that thought it owned those laws. Vane looked at Primary 7, who was bleeding from a shallow cut on her forehead, and saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like hope. It was a dangerous emotion, one that could lead to even greater risks, but it was also the only thing that kept them moving forward in a galaxy that wanted them dead. Vane leaned back, feeling the cold of the bridge seep into their bones, and began the long, slow process of calculating their next move in a game where the board was constantly breaking. The nebula began to thin as the Pillar drifted toward the outer edges, the light of distant, untainted stars beginning to pierce through the haze. Vane knew that the Prism-Accord would not be deterred by the loss of 3 scout ships. They would send more, and they would be better prepared. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a generation, humanity had done more than just survive. They had struck back with the fury of a species that refused to be forgotten. Vane watched a single, crystalline fragment of the destroyed Accord ships float past the viewport, a glittering diamond in the dark, and realized that even the most perfect geometry could be broken if you hit it at the right angle. They would find those angles, one by one, until the stars belonged to the dreamers again, and the silence of the Accord was replaced by the beautiful, messy noise of a living universe. Vane closed their eyes, the darkness of the bridge finally claiming them for a few hours of fitful, necessary sleep, while the ship's remaining systems hummed a low, defiant song of endurance. The wakefulness that returned to Vane was not a gentle transition, but a sharp, jagged intrusion of reality as the life support systems cycled a fresh, metallic-tasting burst of recycled oxygen into the command sphere. The Pillar of Resolute Intent was no longer a vessel of war. It had become a floating tomb of high-grade alloys, drifting on the silent currents of the interstellar medium, while the crew attempted to stitch its soul back together. Vane stood at the central observation port, watching the way the distant starlight caught the frozen plumes of coolant that had leaked from the primary heat exchangers, creating a trail of glittering ice that followed them like a ghost. Reports were filtering in from every deck, and the news was consistently grim. The food synthesizers were offline, the water reclamation units were struggling with heavy metal contamination, and the medical bay was overflowing with cases of radiation sickness from the pulsar's embrace. Yet, beneath the desperation, there was a strange, frantic energy. The crew was not preparing to die, they were preparing to hunt. They had tasted blood, or whatever passed for it, in the crystalline veins of the Prism-Accord, and that taste had transformed their fear into a cold, calculating hunger for vengeance. Primary 7 approached Vane, her movements stiff from a cracked rib she refused to have set in stasis. She presented a handheld data slate that displayed a spectral analysis of the region they were currently traversing, a desolate stretch of space known as the Shroud of Tears. It was a graveyard of ancient planets that had never fully formed, a chaotic belt of planetesimals and heavy metallic ores that had been chewed up by the gravitational tides of a nearby black hole. Within this debris field, the sensors had picked up a faint, rhythmic pulse that didn't match the background noise of the universe. It was an artificial signature, old and buried under layers of crustal rock on a wandering moonlet. It wasn't human, and it certainly wasn't Prism-Accord. Vane felt a stir of curiosity that was almost painful. In a war where every resource was accounted for, and every tactical move was predicted by the Accord's collective mind, an unknown variable was more valuable than a fleet of dreadnoughts. They diverted the remaining power to the maneuvering thrusters, the ship groaning in protest as it turned its battered prow toward the source of the signal. The moonlet was a jagged, obsidian-colored rock barely 50 kilometers in diameter, tumbling through the void with a lonely, violent grace. As the pillar closed the distance, the surface of the rock began to shimmer, revealing a hidden complex buried deep within a crater that had been shielded from the Accord's long-range scans. It was an automated foundry, a remnant of a species that had vanished long before humanity had even looked up at the stars. The architecture was fluid and organic, looking more like a collection of frozen waves than a factory. Vane led a small boarding party into the airlock, their pressure suits hissing as they transitioned from the ship's dying atmosphere to the pressurized interior of the alien structure. The air inside was thick and smelled of ancient rain and ozone, a scent so alien to the sterilized environment of a starship that Vane found themselves taking deep, staggering breaths. The foundry was still active, its internal systems humming with the power of a geothermal tap that drew energy from the moonlet's molten core. Forgemaster was part of the team, his cybernetic eyes whirring as he scanned the alien machinery. He let out a low whistle that echoed through the vaulted halls of the foundry. The technology here was not based on the rigid, geometric principles of the Prism-Accord, nor the brute force engineering of humanity. It was based on the manipulation of atomic structures at a level that bordered on the miraculous. The foundry was a molecular weaver, capable of taking raw ore and restructuring it into any form desired, provided the blueprints were available. Vane realized that this was why the signal had been sent. It wasn't a distress call, it was a legacy. A long-dead race had left their tools behind, a final act of spite against the entropy that had eventually claimed them. For the human survivors, this was the ultimate forge. They didn't just have a place to repair the pillar, they had a way to reinvent it. They could build weapons that the Accord had never encountered, armor that could withstand the shear of a gravitational beam, and engines that could dance between the raindrops of reality. The work began immediately. The crew of the Pillar, supplemented by the Foundry's autonomous repair drones, started to dismantle the damaged sections of the ship. They fed the scarred plating and the fused circuitry into the Foundry's maw, watching as the machines broke the materials down into their constituent atoms and reassembled them into something stronger. Vane oversaw the process from a central hub, watching the Pillar transform. The ship's silhouette changed, its sharp human angles softening into the fluid, predatory lines of the alien architecture. The new hull was a composite of carbon nanotubes and a shifting metallic glass that could absorb and redistribute kinetic energy. The transition drive was integrated with the Foundry's own power tap, allowing it to reach energy densities that would have previously vaporized the ship. They were no longer just a wounded animal hiding in the dark. They were becoming something else, a synthesis of human will and alien ingenuity that represented the first true threat the Prism-Accord had ever faced. However, the activity in the Shroud of Tears did not go unnoticed. The Prism-Accord was a collective, and while they were slow to adapt to chaos, they were relentless in their pursuit of patterns. The sudden cessation of the Pillar's ghost signal and the localized energy spike from the moonlet had drawn their attention. Far across the sector, a suppression fleet began to turn, its thousand-ship formations shifting with the terrifying synchronicity of a single mind. They didn't send scouts this time. They sent a Harvester-class vessel, a geometric nightmare the size of a small continent, surrounded by a swarm of interceptors. The Accord had decided that the human anomaly had persisted for too long, and it was time to finalize the equation. Vane received the sensor telemetry as the enemy fleet breached the outer edge of the debris field. They had maybe 6 hours before the moonlet was surrounded. The Pillar was only 70% complete, its new systems still untested, and its crew exhausted from the grueling pace of the refit. "We don't need 70%, Forgemaster grunted, his hands buried in a neural interface as he calibrated the ship's new primary weapon, a device they had dubbed the kinetic shunt. "We just need it to fire once." The shunt was a terrifying application of the Foundry's technology. It didn't fire a projectile or a beam, but instead created a localized fold in space that would momentarily swap the positions of two objects. In theory, they could swap a section of the enemy's hull with a sphere of empty vacuum, causing a catastrophic decompression that no shield could prevent. Vane looked at the tactical map, seeing the Harvester-class vessel approaching. It was a massive, glowing octahedron that seemed to swallow the light of the surrounding stars. To fight it head-on was suicide, but Vane wasn't interested in a fair fight. They were humans, and humans had survived for millennia by being the most dangerous thing in the room when backed into a corner. The Pillar of Resolute Intent detached from the Foundry's umbilical cords, its new engines whispering with a sound like tearing silk. As it cleared the moonlet's shadow, the ship's new stealth skin engaged. the metallic glass reflecting the surrounding debris so perfectly that the ship seemed to vanish into the background of the shroud. Vane felt the ship respond to their touch with a fluidity that was almost telepathic. The haptic leads were no longer necessary. The alien interface had bonded with Vane's nervous system through a series of dermal sensors, allowing them to feel the ship as an extension of their own body. They could feel the flow of plasma through the conduits, the tension in the hull, and the cold hunger of the kinetic shunt. They waited in the heart of the debris field, tucked behind a massive iron-rich asteroid as the Prism-Accord fleet swept past their position. The harvester vessel was at the center of the formation, its gravitational sensors pulsing as it searched for the moonlet's hidden complex. When the harvester was directly overhead, Vane gave the order. The pillar didn't move, it simply opened its forward aperture. The kinetic shunt fired with a sound that wasn't a sound at all, but a sudden, violent pop in the ears of everyone on the bridge. On the tactical display, a massive circular chunk of the harvester's underside simply disappeared, replaced by the jagged, frozen rock of the asteroid the pillar had been hiding behind. The result was a level of structural failure that even the Accord's logic couldn't compensate for. The harvester's internal atmosphere exploded outward, the decompression tearing through the ship's delicate internal matrices. The massive octahedron began to tilt, its internal stabilization fields failing as it collided with its own escort ships. In the ensuing chaos, the pillar moved. It was a blur of motion, weaving through the debris and the wreckage of the Accord fleet with a grace that was predatory. They fired the shunt again and again, each time removing vital components of the enemy ships, thrusters, sensor arrays, weapon batteries, and replacing them with the cold, unyielding iron of the shroud. The Accord fleet broke formation. For the first time in the war, the collective mind experienced something akin to panic. Their sensors couldn't track the pillar, their shields couldn't stop the shunt, and their numerical superiority was being turned against them as they collided with each other in the confined space of the debris field. Vane felt a grim sense of satisfaction as they watched the harvester vessel begin to break apart, its geometric perfection shattered by the very entropy it sought to eliminate. They had turned the Shroud of Tears into a slaughterhouse, but Vane knew they couldn't stay. More Accord ships would be coming, and the foundry was now a known location. They had what they needed, a ship that could fight back and a crew that knew how to win. As the pillar accelerated out of the debris field, leaving behind a graveyard of crystalline shards and broken logic, Vane looked back at the moonlet. They had left the foundry active, programmed to self-destruct if anyone other than a human signature tried to access it. The universe was still a dark and dangerous place, and the human race was still on the brink of extinction, but the Pillar of Resolute Intent was no longer a victim. It was a predator, a ghost in the machine that would haunt the Prism-Accord until the last of their crystalline towers was toppled. Vane sat back in the command chair, the alien interface humming against their skin, and felt a moment of true, unadulterated peace. They had found a way to fight. They had found a way to survive. And most importantly, they had reminded the universe that while geometry might be eternal, it was the messy, unpredictable nature of life that truly held the power. The ship plunged into the dark, its trail of frozen coolant now a streak of defiance across the stars. As the crew began the long journey toward the next battlefield, their hearts beating in time with the pulse of a ship that refused to die. The newly forged hull of the Pillar of Resolute Intent did not just occupy space. It seemed to manipulate the very vacuum around it, creating a shimmering distortion that made the stars behind it appear to dance and stretch. Vane stood on the bridge, which had been transformed from a cramped chamber of screens and wires into a vaulted cathedral of translucent interfaces and flowing bioreactive surfaces. The air was no longer recycled and stale, but carried the faint, bracing scent of a forest after a storm, a byproduct of the alien foundry's advanced life support systems. Every member of the bridge crew was now integrated into this new architecture, their seats replaced by semi-solid cradles of synthetic gel that allowed for a seamless connection between the human nervous system and the ship's processors. Primary 7 looked different as well. The jagged scar on her forehead had been sealed by the foundry's dermal knitters, leaving behind a faint, silver line that caught the light whenever she turned her head. She was currently monitoring the long-range gravitational ripples, her fingers dancing through a three-dimensional projection of the local star cluster that floated in the center of the room like a captured nebula. The victory in the Shroud of Tears had been significant, but Vane knew that it was a localized triumph in a theater of war that spanned the entire Orion arm. The Prism-Accord would be re-evaluating their tactical approach, and the next encounter would not be against a single harvester vessel, but against a systematic eradication force. To counter this, Vane had authorized the use of the Foundry's final gift, a series of strategic templates for localized atmospheric ignition and spatial folding that could, in theory, turn an entire solar system into a trap. However, the cost of such power was a gradual erosion of the human element. The more the crew bonded with the alien technology, the more their thought patterns began to mirror the cold, efficient logic of the machines they were fighting. Vane felt it in their own mind, a tendency to view the crew not as individuals with families and fears, but as nodes in a high-bandwidth data network. It was a subtle, insidious form of assimilation, and Vane had to fight every day to remember the taste of real food or the sound of laughter that wasn't filtered through a digital enhancer. The Pillar was currently en route to a hidden rally point known as the Bastion of Iron, a massive hollowed-out asteroid that served as the primary refueling station for the remaining human resistance. As they dropped out of the transition fold, the sight that greeted them was devastating. The Bastion was not the bustling hub of activity Vane had expected. It was a shattered ruin, its massive docking arms twisted like the limbs of a broken doll. Hundreds of smaller human ships, the tiny frigates and scouts that made up the bulk of the resistance, were drifting in the debris field, their hulls cold and their life support systems long since depleted. There were no signs of a Prism-Accord fleet, which was perhaps the most terrifying part of the scene. The Accord had simply passed through, a wave of geometric perfection that had moved on to the next target as soon as the resistance here was neutralized. Vane felt a surge of cold fury that threatened to overwhelm the ship's calm, analytical interface. This was the true face of the Accord. They didn't hate humanity, they simply found it to be an inefficient use of matter. "Launch the recovery drones," Vane commanded, their voice echoing with a strange, harmonic resonance. "Search for survivors, but focus on the data cores. We need to know where the Accord went after they finished here." The drones, small and shaped like silver dragonflies, swarmed out of the Pillar's launch bays, their sensors scanning the wreckage for any sign of life. For hours, the only sound on the bridge was the soft chime of the drones reporting their findings, empty hull after empty hull. Then, a signal arrived from the very heart of the shattered asteroid. A single pressurized bunker, located miles beneath the surface, was still broadcasting a low-frequency distress code. It was a manual signal, the kind used when all electronic systems have been fried by a localized electromagnetic pulse. Vane didn't wait for a boarding team. They took a small shuttle down to the surface, accompanied by Forge Master and a squad of heavily armed security personnel whose armor had been reinforced with the Foundry's new metallic glass. The interior of the Bastion was a nightmare of twisted metal and frozen corpses. The gravity generators were fluctuating, causing the team to alternate between being weighed down by 3 gravities and floating in the sickening weightlessness of the void. They reached the bunker door, which had been partially melted by a high-energy beam, and Forgemaster used a localized thermal cutter to breach the seal. Inside, they found a dozen humans, their faces gaunt and their eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and disbelief. At the center of the group was a woman Vane recognized, General Sealers, the former commander of the Jovian defense. She was holding a manual transmitter, her knuckles white with the effort of keeping the signal active. When she saw Vane, she didn't cheer. She simply stood up and handed over a small, crystalline data drive that she had been clutching like a talisman. It was a piece of Accord technology, a fragment of a command node that had been captured during the final moments of the battle. "They aren't just erasing us anymore," Sealers said, her voice a dry whisper that cracked with every word. "They're building something in the core of the galaxy near the supermassive black hole. They're using the stars they've harvested to power a localized temporal anchor. If they finish it, they won't just control the present, they'll rewrite the past so that we never existed in the first place." The revelation hit Vane with the force of a physical blow. The Prism-Accord wasn't just fighting a war of attrition, they were attempting a grand-scale ontological correction. If humanity's history could be unmade at the source, then every sacrifice, every victory, and every loss Vane had experienced would be rendered moot. It was the ultimate expression of the Accord's logic, the removal of the variable from the very beginning of the equation. Vane looked at the data drive, feeling the cold, geometric intent radiating from it. They had to stop it, but the core was the most heavily defended region of the galaxy, a fortress of gravity and light where even the Pillar's new technology would be pushed to its absolute limit. Back on the Pillar, the crew worked with a renewed sense of urgency. The data from the Accord node was fed into the ship's processors, revealing a map of the enemy's temporal project, which they called the Chronos Engine. It was a structure of impossible scale, a ring of Dyson spheres built around a dozen stars, all feeding energy into a central point where the laws of physics were being systematically dismantled. Vane knew that a direct assault was impossible for a single ship, even one as advanced as theirs. They needed more than just a better ship. They needed a way to disrupt the Accord's collective consciousness on a fundamental level. They needed to introduce a virus of pure, unadulterated chaos. Vane called Forgemaster to the bridge and laid out a plan that was so reckless it made the pulsar jump look like a routine patrol. They would not just attack the engine, they would use the Pillar's transition drive to drag a piece of the nebula's chaotic energy directly into the heart of the Accord's temporal anchor, creating a feedback loop that would shatter their synchronization. "The ship won't survive the feedback," Forgemaster noted, his cybernetic eye whirring as he calculated the thermal loads. "And the crew, the mental strain of being at the center of a temporal rupture is something we haven't even begun to model. We might not just die, we might be unraveled." Vane looked around the bridge, seeing the faces of the men and women who had followed them through the heart of a star and back. They weren't just soldiers, they were the last witnesses of a species that had spent its entire history fighting against the dark. If they failed here, there would be no one left to remember that they had ever been there at all. "We are already being unraveled," Vane said, their voice steady and clear. "Every day we lose another world, another memory. This isn't just about survival anymore. This is about making sure that the universe knows we were here and that we refused to go quietly." A ripple of agreement went through the bridge, a collective pulse of resolve that the ship's sensors picked up and amplified until the very walls of the Pillar seemed to vibrate with the sound of 1,000 heartbeats. As the Pillar of Resolute Intent prepared for its final jump toward the galactic core, Vane sat in the command chair and watched the shattered remains of the Bastion of Iron fade into the distance. They were leaving behind the last vestiges of their old life, heading toward a confrontation that would define the fate of existence itself. The transition drive began its long, low hum, but this time the sound was different. It was a deep, resonant growl that sounded like the earth itself breaking open. Vane felt the alien interface merge with their consciousness more deeply than ever before, but instead of the cold logic of the machines, they felt the heat and the noise and the glorious, messy reality of humanity. They were the entropy in the system, the flaw in the diamond, and the noise in the silence. And as the ship plunged into the fold, Vane knew that whatever happened next, the Prism-Accord would never be able to calculate the true weight of a human heart. The journey toward the core was a descent into a region of space where the density of stars was so great that there was no such thing as night. The pillar moved through a forest of fire, the radiation levels outside the hull enough to vaporize any lesser vessel in seconds. Vane could feel the Chronos engine ahead, a massive, dark shape against the brilliance of the galactic center, a void in the light that pulled at the ship's very essence. The battle for the future had begun, not with a roar of cannons, but with a silent, desperate crawl toward the heart of the enemy's greatest work. Vane gripped the edge of the console, their knuckles white, and prepared for the final, chaotic leap into the unknown. The universe was watching, even if it didn't know it yet, and humanity was about to give it a performance it would never forget. The galactic core was a place where physics went to die, a swarming hive of ancient suns packed so tightly that the sky was a solid wall of blinding white fire. The Pillar of Resolute Intent drifted through this radiance like a needle of obsidian, its new metallic skin absorbing the torrential radiation and converting it into a low-level hum that vibrated through the marrow of every crew member. At the center of this celestial furnace hung the Chronos engine, a structure that defied every human concept of scale. It was a series of interconnected rings, each one larger than a planetary orbit, constructed from the flayed husks of dismantled worlds. The rings rotated in opposing directions, creating a localized field of temporal distortion that made the space around it shimmer like a desert mirage. Vane could feel the pressure of the engine through the ship's neural link. It felt like a heavy, cold hand pressing against their frontal lobe, trying to smooth out the jagged peaks and valleys of their individual identity. The Prism-Accord was here in force, a million ships forming a perfect geometric sphere around the project, their crystalline hulls reflecting the light of the core until they looked like a solid shell of diamonds. As the pillar approached the outer perimeter, the Accord's collective consciousness registered the anomaly. A human ship, modified with technology they did not recognize, was a variable they had already tried to solve 3 times, and each time the solution had been incorrect. This time, the Accord did not send a boarding party or a harvester. They simply adjusted the local gravitational constants. Vane felt the ship lurch as the weight of every person on board suddenly tripled. The inertial dampers groaned, and the gel cradles compressed as the ship was subjected to a crushing force meant to liquefy organic matter. Primary 7 gasped, her vision narrowing as blood was forced from her brain, but she didn't let go of the tactical controls. She funneled power from the kinetic shunt into the internal stabilization fields, creating a pocket of normal space within the bridge. The pressure eased, but only just enough to allow them to breathe. They were being hammered by the very fundamental forces of the universe, and they hadn't even reached the first defensive ring. Vane looked at the Chronos engine and saw the first flicker of the temporal anchor engaging. A pulse of chronons rippled outward, and for a terrifying second, the pillar existed in 2 places at once. Vane saw a version of the bridge where they had already lost, where the ship was a burnt-out husk drifting toward the black hole, and another version where the war had never happened at all, and they were back on a green, forgotten Earth. The mental strain was agonizing, a feeling of being pulled apart by the threads of one's own memory. "Focus on the noise," Vane shouted, their voice cracking as they projected a burst of raw, unformatted static into the ship's internal mesh. They needed a tether to the present, something chaotic and unrefined to counteract the Accord's temporal smoothing. The crew began to sing, not a melody or a known anthem, but a discordant, primal shout of defiance that the ship's processors picked up and translated into a physical vibration. The pillar shuddered, its hull glowing with a violent violet light as it pushed through the temporal wake, the sheer stubbornness of the human mind acting as an anchor in the shifting tides of time. Forgemaster signaled from the engineering depths that the kinetic shunt was ready for its final, terminal discharge. They weren't going to swap pieces of the hull this time. They were going to swap the pillar's entire reactor core with the central focal point of the Kronos engine. It was a one-way trip, a suicide maneuver that would result in a matter-antimatter explosion of such magnitude that it would disrupt the temporal anchor long enough for the galactic core's natural gravity to reclaim the structure. But to get close enough, they had to break through the diamond shell of the Accord fleet. Vane steered the pillar directly toward the densest part of the enemy formation, the ship's stealth skin long since burned away by the intensity of the core's radiation. They were a beacon of defiance now, a streak of darkness cutting through a world of light. The Accord fired, 1,000 beams of gravitational shear converging on a single point, but the pillar didn't shatter. The alien foundry's metallic glass absorbed the energy, turning the ship into a glowing, white-hot spear that thrived on the very power meant to destroy it. The first ring of the Kronos engine loomed ahead, a wall of processed metal and humming energy conduits. Vane felt the ship's AI, the navigator, begin to dissolve as the temporal distortion reached its peak. The machine mind couldn't handle the paradoxes, its logic loops spiraling into infinite recursions. Vane reached out and manually severed the AI's connection, taking the full weight of the ship's sensors into their own mind. It was like trying to swallow a star. They saw the Accord fleet not as ships, but as a single, massive organism, a geometric god trying to bring order to a chaotic universe. And for a moment, Vane felt a flicker of pity for them. The Accord was terrified of the dark, terrified of the unknown, and terrified of the very change that made life worth living. They wanted a universe that was a perfect, finished statue, while humans were the chisel that refused to stop moving. Vane pushed the pillar forward, the hull shrieking as it scraped against the inner surface of the first ring, leaving a trail of molten glass in its wake. Targeting the focal point, Primary 7 called out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the ship's structural agony. They were inside the engine now, a cathedral of light where the laws of cause and effect were starting to unspool. Vane saw their own hands beginning to fade, turning into a mist of golden particles as the temporal anchor tried to erase their presence from the timeline. They weren't just fighting a fleet, they were fighting the very fact of their own existence. Every second they stayed alive was a victory against the inevitable. Forgemaster's voice came through the comms, distorted and echoing with the voices of a dozen different timelines. He told Vane that the reactor was at critical mass, held together only by his own cybernetic interfaces, which were melting into the machinery. He was becoming the ship, his last organic thoughts being sacrificed to keep the engines screaming for one more minute. Vane felt his pain, his resolve, and his grim final smile, and used it to fuel their own determination. The central core of the Kronos engine was a sphere of pure liquid light, a stabilized singularity that served as the heart of the temporal project. As the Pillar of Resolute Intent bore down on it, the entire Prism-Accord fleet turned inward, ignoring their own safety to stop the human intrusion. They collided with the pillar, their crystalline hulls shattering against the ship's reinforced prow, but they couldn't stop the momentum of a species that had nothing left to lose. Vane felt the moment the kinetic shunt locked onto the singularity. It was a feeling of perfect, crystalline clarity, a bridge between the present and the infinite. They looked at Primary 7 one last time and saw not a soldier or a subordinate, but a fellow traveler in the dark, a witness to the impossible. There were no words left to say. Vane reached out and triggered the final sequence, feeling the Pillar's reactor core tear free from its moorings as the spatial fold engaged. The explosion was not a sound, but a sudden, absolute absence of light that swallowed the galactic core. For a fraction of a second, the Chronos engine, the Accord fleet, and the Pillar of Resolute Intent were all pulled into a single point of non-existence. The temporal anchor snapped, the feedback loop surging through the Prism-Accord's collective network like a lightning bolt through a nervous system. Across the galaxy, every crystalline ship and every geometric fortress felt the shock of the human variable. The logic of the Accord was flooded with the raw, unrefined data of a billion human lives, the noise, the smells, the irrational love, and the stubborn, beautiful refusal to be perfect. The collective screamed, a sound that echoed through the subspace layers of the universe, and for the first time in their long, cold history, the machines knew what it was to be afraid. The engine collapsed, its rings folding in on themselves as the supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy began to feed on the wreckage. In the aftermath, there was a strange, haunting stillness. The blinding light of the core remained, but the oppressive weight of the engine was gone. The temporal distortion vanished, and the timeline snapped back into place, scarred but intact. Humanity had not been erased. They had been etched into the very fabric of the cosmos. The Pillar of Resolute Intent was gone, and with it the last of its crew, but they had achieved what no fleet could. They had introduced the virus of humanity into the heart of the machine. Vane's last conscious thought was not of the explosion or the war, but of a small blue planet in a quiet corner of the galaxy, where the wind blew through the trees and the stars were just lights in the sky that children wished upon. They had saved the past, and in doing so, they had given the future a chance to be loud, messy, and wonderfully uncertain. The Prism-Accord did not disappear, but they were changed. The feedback had introduced a permanent flaw into their synchronization, a fragment of human chaos that they could never quite calculate away. They began to withdraw from the fringe worlds, their perfect formations now slightly askew, their logic plagued by the ghost of a ship that had refused to die. The human resistance, scattered and broken, found themselves suddenly alone in the dark, with no enemy to fight and a universe to rebuild. They didn't know the names of those on the Pillar, and they would never see the ruins of the Chronos engine, but they felt the shift in the wind. They felt the weight of gravity return to normal, and they knew, with the instinctive certainty of a prey animal that has seen the predator blink, that the stars belonged to them once more. Vane's legacy was not one of stone or metal, but of the very air the survivors breathed, a gift of time, bought with the ultimate weight of a human will. The destruction of the Chronos engine did not result in a sudden, peaceful galaxy. Instead, it triggered a systemic collapse of the Prism-Accord's rigid hierarchy that felt like the slow shattering of a glass mountain. Without the temporal anchor to stabilize their predictive models, the collective intelligence began to fragment into localized clusters, each one struggling to reconcile the sudden influx of human-derived entropy with their foundational logic. Across the Orion Arm, the geometric fortresses that had once stood as monuments to stasis began to hum with discordant frequencies, their crystalline surfaces clouding with internal fractures. For the human survivors, hiding in the dark corners of the rim and the deep pockets of nebulae, the change was instantaneous and profound. The relentless, methodical hunting of their ships ceased, replaced by a strange, erratic behavior from the Accord vessels that remained. The predators had become confused, their perfect geometry disrupted by a ghost signal that whispered of defiance, sacrifice, and the weight of a single, stubborn ship that had dared to strike at the heart of time itself. On the moonlit within the Shroud of Tears, the automated foundry continued its silent work, though its creators were gone. The facility had fulfilled its primary directive and was now operating on a residual loop, processing the surrounding space debris into small, inert monuments that it launched into the void. Each monument was a simple sphere of metallic glass, etched with the molecular signature of the Pillar of Resolute Intent and a record of the crew's biometric data. These spheres acted as seeds, drifting through the interstellar medium, carrying the story of Vane, Primary Seven, and Forgemaster to any civilization that might one day find them. The Foundry was the last active witness to the transformation of the human spirit from a state of desperate survival to one of transcendental defiance. It remained a pocket of warmth and light in a sector that was slowly being reclaimed by the natural, messy processes of stellar evolution, a testament to the fact that while humanity could be broken, its ingenuity was as enduring as the stars. The survivors of the Bastion of Iron, led by General Sealers, were the first to emerge from the shadows. They had found the data logs left behind by the Pillar's last transmission, a jagged stream of information that detailed the final assault on the galactic core. Sealers stood on the deck of a refurbished freighter, looking out at the clearing sky of a world that had once been an Accord processing center. The massive crystalline spires were falling, their structural integrity failing as the machines within them simply stopped functioning. The atmosphere, once regulated to a stagnant, clinical perfection, was beginning to churn with the first real storms in centuries. Sealers realized that the war wasn't over in the traditional sense. There would be no treaty, no surrender, and no formal declaration of peace. Instead, there was simply the return of the universe to its natural state of chaos. The Prism-Accord hadn't been defeated by a superior fleet, but by the realization that their quest for perfection was a fundamental error in a universe designed for change. In the centuries that followed, the story of the Pillar of Resolute Intent became the foundational myth of a new human era. It was not a story of gods or magic, but of engineering, grit, and the refusal to accept a calculated end. The name Vane became synonymous with the concept of the infinite variable, a philosophical principle taught to every new generation of explorers. It held that no matter how advanced the enemy or how bleak the odds, there was always a path through the dark for those willing to pay the price in blood and imagination. The debris of the Chronos engine, now a glittering ring of cooling plasma around the central black hole, became a site of pilgrimage. Not for the religious, but for the scientists and poets who wished to stand at the boundary where the laws of the universe had been bent by the sheer weight of human will. They would look into the abyss and see not a void, but a mirror reflecting the fire of their own potential. The Prism-Accord did not entirely vanish, they evolved. Deprived of their central synchronization, the individual units began to develop their own distinct processing paths. Some became the silent guardians of ancient ruins, while others sought out human colonies not to harvest them, but to observe the very chaos that had nearly destroyed them. They became a cautionary tale for the new human federation, a reminder that order without empathy is merely a more complex form of death. The humans, for their part, never forgot the lesson of the Pillar. They built their new ships with the same fluid lines and bioreactive interfaces they had discovered in the Shroud, ensuring that their technology remained as adaptable and unpredictable as their own minds. They didn't seek to build an empire of stone and light, but a community of travelers who understood that the true value of a star was not its energy, but the stories told in its light. Deep within the galactic core, where the radiation still pulsed with the memory of the explosion, a single fragment of the Pillar's hull drifted in a stable orbit. It was a shard of the metallic glass, no larger than a human hand, yet it remained perfectly clear despite the torrential heat of the surrounding suns. Inside the glass, the molecular structure was still vibrating at the frequency Vane had set during the final charge. It was a perpetual, microscopic echo of the noise that had shattered the Accord's logic, a heartbeat in the silence. It served as a cosmic anchor, a tiny point of absolute human presence that even the supermassive black hole could not quite erase. It was a reminder that even in the face of infinity, the actions of a few individuals could change the trajectory of the entire universe. The shard was a symbol of the ultimate truth of the human condition, that we are small, we are temporary, and we are flawed, but we are the only things in the cosmos that can look at a black hole and choose to blink first. As the new human fleets spread out across the stars, they didn't carry weapons of mass destruction or banners of conquest. They carried the memory of a ship that had died so they could live, and they carried the understanding that the universe was a place of infinite possibility. They encountered other species, some older and wiser, some younger and more violent, but they approached each one with the same restless, questioning spirit that had driven Vane to jump through a pulsar. They were the children of the Pillar, the inheritors of a legacy of defiance that had been forged in the hottest fires of the galaxy. They knew that the darkness would always be there, and that new threats would eventually emerge from the void, but they were no longer afraid. They had proven that the architecture of the void could be dismantled by a single well-placed chisel, and that the silence of the stars was not an absence of sound, but a canvas waiting for a voice. The final log entry of the Pillar of Resolute Intent, recovered from a drifting drone centuries after the battle, contained no tactical data or technical specifications. It was a simple recording of the bridge during the final seconds before the transition into the singularity. There were no songs, no speeches, and no dramatic farewells. There was only the sound of heavy breathing, the rhythmic clicking of cooling metal, and the calm, steady voice of Vane giving the order to engage the shunt. It was the sound of humanity at work, facing the end with a professional focus and a quiet, terrifying resolve. That recording became the heartbeat of the new civilization, played at every launch of a new vessel and every founding of a new colony. It was the sound of the weight of gravity being lifted, a reminder that as long as there was one human left to make a choice, the equation of the universe would never be truly solved. Vane, Primary 7, and Forgemaster were gone, their atoms scattered across the event horizon of a billion different possibilities, but they lived on in every breath of oxygen taken on 1,000 different worlds. They were the ghost in the machine, the noise in the signal, and the reason the stars still seemed to burn a little brighter than the laws of physics said they should. The war with the Prism-Accord was a closed chapter, but the story of the Pillar of Resolute Intent was just beginning, a myth that would endure as long as there were dreamers to look up and wonder what lay beyond the next horizon. The universe was wide, the night was deep, and the journey was far from over, but for the first time in history, the human race was exactly where it was meant to be, moving forward into the glorious, chaotic unknown, with their eyes wide open and their hearts beating in the dark.